Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 4 lecture where we're going to be covering homeostatic systems and drugs. So, let's start as always by going over today's learning objectives. The first is that by the end, you should be able to explain the similarities and differences between the nervous and endocrine systems, describe how a neuron functions, describe the role of receptors, distinguish between receptor agonists and antagonists, describe the features of principal neurotransmitters associated with drug addiction, describe the principal components of the central nervous system and endocrine system, identify which brain areas are most likely to be affected by drug use or abuse, explain the endorphin and cannabinoid nervous systems, distinguish between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and explain how and why anabolic steroids are abused. So let's begin with an introduction to homeostatic functions and systems. So homeostasis is the body's attempt to simply maintain internal stability and balance. Drugs alter the physiological and psychological balances that are mediated by both neurotransmitters and hormones within the body. These alterations change the status and function of the nervous system or endocrine system. So now we're going to jump into explaining a neuron. So neurons are specialized nerve cells that make up the nervous system and release neurotransmitters. They are responsible for conducting homeostatic functions of the brain by receiving and sending information. The receiving region of a neuron, labeled as B, is affected by an electrochemical message that either excites or inhibits the neuron from sending a message. If it excites, the chemical impulse will move from the receiving region down to the axon to the sending region or the terminal. Once the impulse reaches that terminal, the neurotransmitters or chemical messengers are then released and bind to the receptors, labeled as E. Activation of that receptor by the neurotransmitter then changes the activity of the target cell that makes up our organs, muscles, and our glands. So, an example is that dopamine is a neurotransmitter that influences or is influenced by amphetamines, causing a state of euphoria, possible agitation, paranoia, or motor changes. Then glia are the supporting cells that are critical for protecting and providing sustenance to these neurons. That's all you need to know about glia. So let's go into homeostatic systems. So when we look at the building blocks of the nervous system is composed of the brain, spinal cord, and neurons that connect our organs and tissues. It also allows the organism to receive information about the internal and external environment and to respond appropriately. So you'll see here the synapse is the point of communication between two neurons. The excitatory will initiate an impulse in the receiving neuron, causing a release of neurotransmitters. If it's inhibitory, it diminishes the likelihood of the impulse in receiving a neuron, or it reduces the activity in the target cell. The synaptic cleft is the gap between two neurons. And then you'll see we have the dendrites here, which are those short branches of neurons that will receive the transmitter signals. And this can be influenced by information from the environment as well as neurons that are surrounding it. And then finally the axon, which is important to know, is a thread-like extension that receives information from those dendrites in the form of electrochemical impulses, transmitting that impulse then to the cell. So, apologies. I thought I just had the diagram on that slide. So then let's look at the nature of drug receptors. So receptors process complex information it receives from each cell as it attempts to maintain homeostasis. So drugs will then either directly or indirectly interact with these receptors. So opiate receptors are specifically activated by opioid narcotic drugs such as heroin and morphine. Endorphins are neurotransmitters that have a narcotic-like effect. You then have cannabinoid systems, which are a biological target of tetrahydrocannabinoid in marijuana. So cannabinoid receptors are linked to mood, reward, motivation, pain perception, decision-making, and even appetite. And then we have anandamide, which are naturally occurring fatty acid neurotransmitters that actually selectively activate those cannabinoid receptors. So let's look at agonistic versus antagonistic effects on drug receptors. Agonistic drug interacts with receptor and produces some type of cellular response. So an example of this is narcotics, which will mimic naturally occurring endorphins and activate the opiate receptors. Another example is that THC activates cannabinoid receptors. So you then have antagonistic drugs, which will interact with the receptor, but they're going to block the response. So an example of this is Naloxone, which actually inhibits opiate receptors. So it blocks the effects of narcotics. So Naloxone is one of those drugs that you would give to someone if they're in the middle of an overdose, and that will block the effect of that opiate that they took and hopefully stop the interaction so that the person does not experience those symptoms and will bring them back. We're then going to cover neurotransmitters. So drugs are going to affect the activity of neurotransmitters by altering their synthesis, storage, release, or their deactivation. So drugs can modify or block the information that's being transmitted, whereby altering the amount of neurotransmitters. Each neurotransmitter has a unique shape and chemical feature and only affects its specific receptor. So common neurotransmitters, we have acetylcholine, which is excitatory, which can be excitatory and inhibitory. If it's excitatory, example is the nicotine receptor, and inhibitory is the muscarinic receptor. So they can act, epinephrine and norepinephrine can actually act on alpha receptor, beta receptors, or both. So we have acetylcholamines, which once released are typically taken back up into the neuron to be used again, which is known as reuptake. And here's where I was discussing epinephrine. So usually epinephrine is excitatory and norepinephrine is usually inhibitory, but it has some excitation. Typically, it's going to act on those alpha receptors, but again, they can act on both. So an alpha receptor will actually constrict blood vessels, whereas beta stimulate the heart. Dopamine is associated with brain regions that regulate mental states and reward systems, as well as fine muscle activity and endocrine functions. Then we have the serotonin, which is inhibitory. So serotonin prevents overreaction to stimuli and regulates the release of hormones from the hypothalamus. So the central nervous system, we know, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So it receives information through input nerves of the PNS. The rectangular activating system is going to control the brain's arousal. So it receives input from all sensory systems and the cerebral cortex, is highly susceptible to effects of drugs, and stimulants activate it while anticholinergic drugs suppress it. We then have the basal ganglia, which are the primary centers for involuntary and fine motor functions. The structures in them are important for developing addictions and will affect decision making. The limbic system regulates emotion, memory, mating, procreation, caring for young, and the reward centers. So this includes the hypothalamus and an assortment of linked brain regions. The cerebral cortex receives sensory input, interprets that incoming information, and then initiates voluntary motor behavior. So the cerebral cortex is the gray matter made up of nerves and support cells. You then have the frontal cortex, which is responsible for storing memories, controlling complex behaviors, processing information, and it also plays a very important role in decision making. Insula are connected with our pleasure pathways. So these are located in the brain and they're important for one's motivation. So again, it could be related to the motivation to do drugs. And then the hypothalamus, which is the central nervous system's control center for ANS and its support functions. So it integrates information from many different places, and the support functions can include cardiovascular activity, hormone release, and even temperature and appetite regulation. So the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, we'll discuss now. So the peripheral nervous system is where the neurons are located outside of the central nervous system. Its input conveys sensory information including pain, pressure, and temperature. Its output activities include either somatic or autonomic. Somatic are your voluntary muscles, and autonomic are your unconscious functions. The ANS, or the autonomic nervous system, controls unconscious functions of the body. So you have your sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is active all the time. Parasympathetic, however, activates only when necessary so that it can conserve energy. So, an example here is how you would ingest amphetamines. The body then releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, which enhances the sympathetic nervous system, which then results in raised blood pressure, speeding up the heart rate, reduces motility of the stomach, and dilates the pupils. So for the autonomic nervous system, its cell bodies of neurons are located in the brain or the spinal cord, but the axons actually project outside of the CNS. And then we have the endocrine system, which consists of ductless glands that secrete hormones directly into our bloodstream. So the endocrine system is responsible for vital functions. We have the pituitary gland, which controls many other glands within the endocrine system. The adrenal gland, which is composed of the cortex and the medulla. So the adrenal medulla is part of the sympathetic nervous system, and it releases adrenaline as well as steroids into the body. Steroids then help the body respond appropriately in crisis and times of stress. The adrenal cortex releases androgens, and androgens produce anabolic effects that increase retention and synthesis of proteins so that our tissues can grow. Also in the endocrine system are our sex glands. So these are responsible for secreting sex hormones that regulate the development and activity of our reproductive systems. So we can see how hormones can be abused, such as anabolic steroids, which are technically a Schedule III substance. So they're able to stimulate the conversion of nutrients into tissue mass. The THG is actually banned by the FDA in products classified as nutritional supplements. And professional athletic organizations actually test for THG now due to the enhancements it can give in performance. So androgens here are the hormone most likely to be abused in the United States because it causes pronounced growth of muscle mass, increases body weight, and can increase strength. Testosterone is an androgen and is the primary natural androgen produced by the testes in men. Negative effects of these hormones can include increases in severe injury, so tears from overgrowth of the muscle. It can impact limbic structures in the brain, causing excitation and a sense of superior strength. It can also cause increases in aggression, headaches, anxiety, insomnia, and paranoia. So again, this designer drug, THG, has been banned by the FDA, and professional athletic organizations test for it now. So in sum, the nervous and endocrine systems help mediate internal and external responses to the environment to achieve homeostasis. The neuron is the principal cell type in the nervous system, consisting of dendrites, a cell body, and an axon that communicates with other neurons or organs by releasing neurotransmitters that excite or inhibit target sites. Receptors will only interact with molecules that have specific shapes and activation of them that can alter functions of the target system. Agonists are substances that stimulate receptors, while antagonists prevent the receptors from being activated. Neurotransmitters can excite, inhibit, or do both, depending on the receptor that is being activated. The limbic system and associated transmitters, including dopamine and serotonin, are highly affected by drugs of abuse. The CNS is composed of the brain and the spinal cord and receives information through input nerves of the peripheral nervous system. The PNS consists of neurons that are located outside of the CNS and includes both input and output activities. The ANS is composed of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, while the endocrine system consists of glands that release hormones and is responsible for vital functions. Finally, anabolic steroids will enhance performance as well as tissue growth, and androgen is the hormone most likely to be abused in the United States. So that was this week's lecture. I hope everyone has a good week, and again, as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.